great. Thank you both for joining. And we're here to talk about a book that Tristram Hunt wrote and recently released called The Radical Potter, The Life and Times of Josiah Wedgwood. I have this right here. And we're also talking with my old teacher, Mark Hewitt, who grew up in Stoke-on-Trent. I worked with Mark in Pittsburgh, North Carolina, a number of years ago for what he called finishing school after I did 2 years with another one of his apprentices in the Asheville area of North Carolina. So this is going to be a great conversation because Mark and I have been talking about this stuff for years and years. Mark was always he always pushed us to look outside of the small sort of studio pottery world that surrounded us. And I'm gonna let you each introduce yourselves. Tell us a bit about your history, yeah, Tristram, I'll let you take it away. So thank you so much for jumping on.
Fabulous to be with you. So my name's Tristram Hunt. I'm the director of the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. I'm talking to you from South Kensington in London, where we have one of the world's great ceramics collections we're very proud to hold. And actually, we just got a display of Richard Batterham on, one of the great studio potters who recently just passed. But I was previously a member of Parliament for Stoke-on-Trent Central, and before that, a historian. And so when I was the MP for Stoke-on-Trent, the figure of Josiah Wedgwood is just an enormously important part of one's life. And I came, as I explain in the book, to think about Wedgwood more, not least because of this great campaign, which we can talk about, to save the Wedgwood collection. And as a result of that passion for Josiah Wedgwood, I over many years, I was determined to try and write a new biography of him. And the enforced lockdown of the last 2 years finally gave me some space to actually do it. And so this new biography of Wedgwood is born of my history in Stoke-on-Trent, my passion and interest in Josiah Wedgwood, and then my kind of amateur, naive enthusiasm for ceramics, which continues here at the Victoria and Albert Museum.
Great. Thank you so much. And Mark?
Well, I'm Mark Hewitt. First, I want to thank Tristram for having written such a fabulous book. On my mother's side, curiously, I've got a connection to the industry. My mother was related to the brothers Gilbert and Guy Harris, who owned the Buller's company that made industrial insulators, those lovely spinal column-like items you see in electrical substations. And Buller's also had a chinoiserie studio during the 30s and 40s. And we had a whole collection of pots made to imitate Chinese pots in our home, whether they were celadons, copper reds, blue and white. And so I had an early introduction to a whole spectrum of ceramics. But without going into too much detail, at a certain point, I decided to become a studio potter rather than become an industrial potter. And I'm sure that we'll touch on that later. But meanwhile, I'm going to pass it back to Alex.
Great. But thank you so much for that introduction from both of you. I have a few questions here. So Tristram, we're going to kick this off with you. And East Fork has a pretty broad and diverse audience. And there may, believe it or not, be some people in that audience who don't necessarily know who Josiah Wedgwood is, and why we're talking about him with great reverence today, when he was a figure from 250 years ago. So give us a broad description of the man and what he did and why you care about him so much.
So Josiah Wedgwood was born in 1730 in Stoke-on-Trent in the potteries of North Staffordshire, which is in the Midlands of England. And this area was known as the potteries because it had this incredible combination Mark well knows, of the clay and the coal, and the combination of the clay and the coal came together to create this ecosystem for ceramics. And Wedgwood was born the 12th child of Thomas and Mary Wedgwood from a generation of potters going back centuries. And he was all set, in a sense, just to be another unknown Wedgwood within the family. But he had this profound genius for design and innovation and experimentation. And in time, a profound genius for business and marketing and sales and exports, and actually also for digging canals and transforming infrastructure and for building houses. And you put all that together, and why he's interesting is that he is a key figure in the history of the Industrial Revolution, and in this great transfer of wealth and power from east to west, this divergence of power which allowed the European economies and the Atlantic economies to grow so successfully. He's a key figure in the consumer revolution which took place on either side of the Atlantic, and he exported huge amounts to the eastern seaboard of America. And he sits at the heart, really, of the industrialization of the process of production of ceramics, that he creates the production line. He creates the market for ceramics. And at the heart of his ambition was always this idea to, as I kind of punningly put it, to take on China at China, to counter Chinese dominance of global ceramics and take on porcelain with his own earthenware, which was a kind of cheap, durable alternative to porcelain. So he is an enormous figure within the history of Britain, within the history, I think, of kind of global geopolitics in terms of the movement of wealth. And then he's a pioneering figure in ceramics, not least through his invention of jasper. And jasper is the new ceramic form that he creates through this process of experimentation. So if you put together the earthenware with the basalt, with the jasper, with the pearlware, he's this remarkable figure in the history of ceramics, as well as design and manufacturing. So all of that, I think, makes him significant. You know, he transformed, as his kind of epitaph has it, the ceramics from this rude, this kind of rude and unformed art into this stylish, well-designed, mass-manufactured product.
That's great. Thank you. That should bring everybody up to speed. So today it's very commonplace that businesses are thinking about how they're interacting with the world in more ways than just creating shareholder value. So the impacts that they have on the community around them, on their environment, the B Corp community, which we just got certified as a B Corp, is sort of a leading example of that. And sometimes that comes up against the interests of investors or people that are sort of helping a business get to where it wants to go. And I'm curious, you know, the first part of that question is, how does that relate back to Josiah Wedgwood and how he approached business? And did he ever run into any issue or fear that his view on the world, which in a lot of ways was counter to a lot of popular opinion at the time, I think, how that would affect his sales channels or his customers and their desire to support what he was doing?
I mean, Wedgwood was a complex figure. He was a great believer in the profit motive and in capitalism. But in a sense, we should understand capitalism in the mid-18th century as a much more radical force and a much more progressive force in some senses than some might approach it today, because a free market was one that was opposed to the kind of old corruption. One that was opposed to the kind of deal making, the back scratching, the influence of corrupt politicians, and so there was a sort of a kind of liberalism around capitalism, which Wedgwood was allied to. At the same time, he was this strong believer in the rights of man. He had read his Thomas Paine. He was a supporter of the American Revolution. He was a supporter of the French Revolution. Above all, he was a campaigner against slavery, and he believed in abolition very, very passionately. And he designed works of art to make the case for abolition. Yet at the same time, for all of that radicalism, the fact of the matter was that to get your pots sold in Georgian England, you had to attract the interest of what he called the legislators in taste. You had to attract the patronage of the royal family, of the leading aristocrats. So he was a great kind of provider to the aristocrats and the power of the day, even as he made the case for, extending the franchise, for reform of parliament, for greater democracy. And in a sense, he didn't let some of those more radical political views often get in the way of his business. Yet at the same time, ultimately, he saw his business as a kind of liberating force, that these forces of capitalism would undo, old style king and court corruption. And it's a kind of challenging combination of views, in a sense, for us in the 21st century to appreciate what I call this radical patriotism was like in the mid 18th century.
Yeah, that grayness, we talk about that a lot at East Fork, because we have very particular views on how things should be done, and sometimes in the interest of growth and scale, we have to ask some difficult questions. And especially today, a lot of people, things are so bifurcated, and people look at the world, especially with social media, in very black and white ways. And in my position as founder, and I do a lot of the investor sort of communications, and I'm often sort of in that funny middle ground, and having to look at things in a way that is more gray. But so that was great.
I could chime in. I think if I draw parallels between Wedgwood and East Fork, a lot of it has to do with market placement. As Wedgwood observed, if you can get that royal and upper class patronage, you can sell a lot of pots, and the word spreads quickly. And through Instagram and the other media that East Fork uses, and the advertising that you've undertaken in GQ and the New York Times, etc., you're appealing to a particular audience that is, in a way, equivalent to the audience that Wedgwood was selling to. And the Trent Mersey Canal could be seen as the conduit by which all the goods moved around England and around the world even. And the internet and Instagram and the way that you use it as the contemporary mode of transportation for your message and for the pots. And so it's a very good form of business. You're reaching the right people. You've got a product that appeals, and there's a particular ethic that you espouse that's similar.
Yeah, marketers today talk about things like influencer marketing and all these, and direct selling D2C brands, which would be considered a direct-to-consumer brand. But yeah, none of this stuff is really that new. Obviously, he was doing the same things 250 years ago.
And he took it seriously. That's what's so interesting. That he understood the value of brand, and he guarded the backstamp, he guarded the brand identity of the product very, very carefully. And so even when you had brilliant designers like Flaxman or Hackwood who worked with him and wanted to put their mark on their wares, he was like, no, this is a Wedgwood and Bentley product. And that was partly also because of the level of kind of imitation and counterfeit of the day. But this notion, again, a kind of, a pre-Marxian notion of the value of the kind of the mystery of money, in a sense, the value of the immaterial embedded in the brand was something he was, I think, one of the early capitalists to appreciate.
And did he have since the very beginning, this driving ambition of scale and of making his mark on the world in this very large way, because it to do something and to drive that much, I mean, it takes a voracious appetite, um, and that he must have had that since early on. But
I mean, you do see in the letters this, there are these wonderful phrases like, I hate piddling, I want to conquer the world. I want to be vase maker general to the universe. I saw the field was spacious. There is a kind of messianic kind of component to it, even as he's slightly joking. But there is, a remarkable, relentless drive to him. And I suppose as a historian, there's this moment that he is part of, which is Great Britain as it was from 1707, entering the world stage as this colonial and imperial power at a moment of great strength. And so if you think of, some of those kind of American products from the sort of 1950s or 60s, when America and the American empire is about to be kind of totally dominant, and that sense of ambition, which is partly connected to a sense of a moment in time, which he had, and it's a conceit in a sense, because I'm bringing all of that together, and he's actually just based in North Staffordshire in Stoke-on-Trent thinking about these things. Yet they do seem to align.
Did he have? Oh, sorry. I just real quickly, did he have a sense, like today, obviously we talk about the extractive natures of capitalism and colonialism, and did he question colonialism at the time? Because if he was against the slave trade, I mean, I would think, was there sort of any inkling of that, of the very real negative consequences of colonialism?
Again, there was this contradiction. He supports the 13 colonies in the struggle against King George III. So there's a kind of anti-colonial moment there. Yet at the same time, he's a complete sort of tub thumper when it comes to a great British naval victory, and we dished it to the Spanish, and and in a sense, his campaign against slavery was also about this idea that the slave trade was kind of imperiling the idea of England, that actually it was doing sort of, quote unquote, it was doing Great Britain moral damage alongside this belief in human equality. But Mark, you might have a different perspective.
No, I think that's right. I mean, it almost, I know that so much of the wealth that came to England was from the sugar trade. It was almost as though there was almost like a sugar rush of enthusiasm for capitalism, for expanding the markets. They'd figured out a mechanism, and by fits and starts, they created these industries that had negative undertones. I mean, the plumes of smoke that came from Stoke-on-Trent, smoky Stoke, and the pollution that accompanies manufacturing even to this day can be seen as a strong negative. And yet we're all plugged into the system now, whether it's via Zoom and the computers we're using. We're all part of a great algorithm that keeps us all spinning along. So I mean, there's benefits to it all. We all, I remember as a youngster wandering around the factory at Stoke, at Spode, and on the one hand, admiring all the work, but on the other hand, it seemed to me at those tender ages that there were all these people doing these grim jobs, like sifting through piles of plates and looking at blanks to see if they were right or not. And it seemed very unfair that there were people doing these awful jobs. But what I realize now is that employment is very valuable, that yes, there were indeed cases of industrial malpractice during those early years of Stoke-on-Trent's industrialization, and they probably continued on for a very long time. My father, in fact, was the president of the Pottery and Glass Benevolent Association that gave money out to victims of industrial injury. And, so it's a Faustian bargain, this world we live in. There's great wealth, but it comes at a price.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And you saw that growing up there and living within that
Mhm.
was that part of your decision to go down and knock on Michael Cardew's door?
Uh, yes, I suppose it was. There are events that happen in your life that you only reflect on later. I had taken a gap year between college and university and had traveled out to India. I'd worked in a warehouse packing china in Germany. I'd done a variety of things that made me question the role that had been placed on me as a likely industrialist. And it turned out that Michael Cardew, having an exhibition, his major retrospective opening in Bristol, next to where I was at university, it turned out that he'd worked as a designer for my grandfather, who was the Lord Mayor of Stoke. And I hadn't a clue about that. So it was one of those apocryphal moments. And off I went and introduced myself. And he was very keen to gain his revenge by stealing me from industry. And off I went down to Cornwall and lived happily ever after. It's been, but it's not without some interest in what's happened to Stoke since, because as Tristram so interestingly portrays in the epilogue of your book, all the changes that were happening to Wedgwood were actually happening in those formative years when I was making a decision to leave the industry. There are various other people like Lawrence Bryan, for instance, son of King Arthur, who ended up being the chairman of Port Merion for a long time. And he and I are contemporaries. And it's interesting to reflect on his career in relation to the decision that I've made with mine. So, what hangs through it all is a sense of ceramic quality, and whether it's handmade. And actually, another wonderful thing I'd like to compliment Tristram on is the reminding me of the word haptic. And I feel like some of my early years as a potter at high school with a knee injury, and I was forced away from the athletic field into the art studio. I feel like I had a haptism, and that there was something about the sense of touch in clay and in picking up handmade objects that continues to resonate. That's a very powerful motivator. And so I think there are all those differences between industrialism and the studio handmade artisanal route that are worth exploring. And I wonder if Alex can comment on your transformation from an artisanal potter to an industrialist.
Yeah, I certainly can. Part of that, I mean, one more thing about you, Mark, is I've never heard you say this, but I think that that growing up in industry and handling a lot of those pots, you throw as if something came out of a slip cast mold. Like when Mark throws a pitcher, most potters throw, and it's pretty heavy, and the clay is probably pretty soft, and maybe there's quite a bit of trimming that has to be done after the fact to get some of the weight out of the thing. And I don't know where Mark got this from, because I don't think Cardew threw like this. You've said he was kind of a terrible thrower. But Mark throws like a machine. Like the plates are so thin and universal, and they have obviously a beautiful quality to them, and the sort of indescribable quality of something hand thrown. But if you pick up one of these pieces, they lift off the table like this. And I just wonder where that came from, because it takes so much physicality. The clay is so hard. It's like ram press material clay that we use on our machines.
It's not. In a sense, I had no choice. I mean, coming from the background I came from, the idea of fine china, going from white light china to heavy brown stuff, wasn't an option. In fact, I remember giving a bowl, one that I finally liked, to my father as a present. And you know what his comment was? He said, "The glaze is crazed." So there was no let up. And to this day, I have a standard of excellence that where it comes from, I don't know. I mean, I think you're inflating it slightly, Alex, but I'll take it. And but I do think that there's an understanding of ceramics that you can be born with, and I feel very lucky to have been born into the household that I was born into, and there's been reconciliation all around. I look now back at industrial ceramics, whether it's Moorcroft, whether it's Midwinter, whether it's any number of the different smaller factories that made wares in Stoke-on-Trent, even Steelite. I mean, there are places I get inspiration to this day from what's being produced in Stoke-on-Trent. So it's always it's open source. I keep on playing with all sorts of things.
There are strong echoes, aren't there, of Wedgwood, because Wedgwood's great, and this again is one of the tensions in him. When Wedgwood wanted to make his workers, he wanted to make machines of the men such as cannot err. So in a sense, he was the great kind of individualist and experimenter and innovator, yet he saw that the future of production actually, from his perspective, involved kind of stripping out that sort of, that some of the individualism that so many of the Stoke hands had within the making of ware. There is that, quite strong tension there you see at a point between kind of labor and capital in his demands, and in sort of denying that Ruskinian ideal of fulfillment through labor, and it's a tension.
Yeah, well, a tension that we have been going through in real time over the last 4 years, as we went from a small wood-fired pottery that I started essentially by myself, and then my friend John, who I see sitting on our dining table, came along, and he'd been through the same type of apprenticeship. He worked with one of Mark's apprentices, Daniel Johnston. And now we have 125 employees, and we have machines that make 3,000 pieces a shift finished. And we've gone through these tensions of, because Ruskin and William Morris were also people that I idolized. It's been challenging in moments to tell a team like the jigger team, we still have some hand jiggers, that there's this new piece of equipment that's coming in, and this process is going to change drastically. But we pay our folks that come in starting sort of on the production floor $20 an hour, which is very good for here. Next year that'll bump up to 21 or 22. And we'll sort of keep raising that. But we have to embrace this technology if we want to do that. We have to. And if we want to keep the price point that is somewhat accessible. What we sell is still relatively expensive, certainly for an industrial product. It's on the more expensive. It's not like a Hermes, piece. But it is. Yeah, it's expensive, and it needs to be expensive. So anyways, that I completely identify with that tension. And that's also, I am not a very good thrower. But what I do get excited about is going around, and I mean, not that I'm inventing new ways to make things like Wedgwood certainly was, but it is a bit of a forgotten thing, especially in the US. Like we've gone through, I mean, as Stoke has too, just over the last 40 years, almost every plant has shut down here in the US, and I can count them on one hand, the large plants that are still left in the US.
And that's one of the things that's interesting about East Fork is that you're sort of in a way bringing China to Asheville, to America. I mean, you're selling nationally, if not globally, at a time when most things have been outsourced to Southeast Asia. And your adaptation to the technology that provides a style that is popular and methods of making it that allow for good wages, good working conditions. It's admirable. It's fantastic that you're able to do it. And I can only see it expanding further.
Yeah.
We can, how about talking about our wives and the importance of the support that we've had, whether it's even mothers and wives, who've provided very strong support, particularly with marketing and administration in my case, and certainly with marketing in your wife Connie's case, and the need to build a coherent, cohesive team is similar in many ways to what Wedgwood was doing with his wife Sally, who was a distant cousin, who was enthusiastic, who knew the pottery world, was extremely supportive. And then, of course, the relationship that Wedgwood had with Bentley, who provided intellectual stimulation. And Connie, in many ways, fills that role too with East Fork.
For us, it's a little different because East Fork, I've provided a lot of the sort of gunpowder that just keeps driving us forward, but something shifted very early on and very quickly, where when Connie came on full time and sort of stepped into the marketing limelight, she became the voice of East Fork. And we just went through a sort of transition on our executive team where she's now the CEO, and I've stepped back. I have the title of founder, board chair, and I'm still doing a lot of the projects that I do, which are sort of looking off into the horizon. That's where I thrive. And Connie's really sort of in charge of day-to-day execution. And we've been just sort of heads down learning about management and really, I mean, we're young and we've never done this before. We didn't go to business school. We don't know anything, but so much of the life, or like the thing that's within the vessel, if I created the vessel, Connie filled it with something that brings people to the table. And that's been very interesting. And John, our third founder, who is a terrific potter, has managed our finances and does it to an exacting degree. And so we had the three of us, and history loves to pinpoint one person as as John Lennon, or but really it's rarely is it one person. One person seems to get the lion's share of the recognition because we love to tell that story of one person, but certainly East Fork is it's a three-legged stool, which is the most stable. So
and the little mantra that we have is that I pedal really fast and my wife steers, because if I steered, I'd steer it off the cliff in a heartbeat, and if she pedaled, it wouldn't get very far. So we muddle along as a very important team.
I mean, I think this notion of collaboration and partnership is really important, because I mean, sort of Wedgwood without Thomas Bentley would have been a much less significant and impressive figure. Thomas Bentley, the great Liverpool merchant with whom he goes into business, provided not only a kind of great understanding of the classical past, and in the move towards neoclassical designs, he was really instrumental in that. He was really important in the marketing, managing the relationships in London, managing the artists that they had in their decorating studios. And then alongside him, Josiah's wife, Sally Wedgwood, his third cousin, but someone who had access to his secrets in terms of the glazes, someone who tried out the teapots, someone who had the kind of last word on the design, someone who gave Wedgwood real insight into the female market, which was such an important part of Wedgwood's success. And then also, crudely, someone who bought, I estimate it as around kind of £4 million sterling in today's money, so kind of $6 million, to to the business, which was invested in plant and manufacturing and equipment, and actually a really, at a moment when cash flow was tight and there were challenges. So it's a significant intervention in terms of his pathway to success. But it was a much broader moment, and also built a happy family with him, and he was devoted to her, absolutely devoted.
That's interesting.
I'm curious if we can just change tack here from the love of our women folk, and but to design. Clearly, one of the things that spelled the end of Wedgwood's dominance was changes in consumer habits. Restaurant trade, everybody started eating out. People didn't, dowry items of Wedgwood or Spode table sets were not important anymore. TV dinners, etc. And and the Rococo style, the neoclassical styles are just not that important. I mean, I've got a little Spode teacup in blue kernel here, which nobody really uses that kind of stuff anymore. Nobody sits down and has tea. Perhaps they do in England, but they certainly don't here. And you've, Alex, have moved into a sort of a mid-century modern style. There are other precedents, whether it's Heath Ceramics out in California, or I'm thinking Steelite in Stoke-on-Trent, that seems to be doing well. Maybe Tristram can elaborate on that too. But how do you see the East Fork style changing, or if in the near future, if at all, or in the long-term future?
Well, there was a few things that were happening. When I started out on my own after working with you, and I built a kiln and was firing, we were selling pots to the people in North Carolina. And North Carolina has this long history, relatively uninterrupted, of making pots and selling them. And it sort of moved through the Industrial Revolution, from when people were making crocks and storage containers, firing them with an alkaline glaze or salt glaze in the Piedmont, moved through the Industrial Revolution to art pottery, and has continued on. And there's a collector base here that we saw was really sort of, there wasn't a whole lot of people filling in the younger demographic of that collector base. So a lot of the people that were coming out to our kiln openings were a little bit older, and they were saying things like, oh, well, I don't have any room in my house to put anything anymore. And we heard that a lot. And we also wanted to sell work to our contemporaries and to our generation. And we saw ceramics having a moment in the sun, another moment in the sun. It sort of goes in cyclical fashion. People getting written up in T Magazine and all of these kind of hip publications, and getting on Instagram and suddenly having 100,000 followers, and it was sort of very cool to be a potter all of a sudden. And it was a lot of folks that hadn't necessarily, who didn't sort of throw with the same kind of dedication and hadn't been through tremendous apprenticeship. And not that there's any issue with that, but we felt like we had something to offer this broader group. And then you were out at our place one day, Mark, and you said, you guys should think of yourselves as industrialists, which was funny. And I can't even remember if we had bought a gas kiln at that time. So we saw all these things happening. We felt like we had something to say. And we also knew we had to move away from wood firing, because it was just going to be impossible to do something and interact with the world in the way we wanted to, just firing a wood kiln 4 times a year. The forms simplified. So I took a lot of the forms that we were making, which did have a sort of an aesthetic that was a little more sort of historical or spoke to the vernacular of North Carolina. And we started simplifying and refining the forms, still with what I think of as our plates, the curve of the plates. If you hold our plate up next to a plate from Steelite, they're very, very different. They still have a pottery quality to them. They're heavier. All of our stuff is heavier. The rims are thick. They have a volume. They have a sense of form that John and I got through apprenticeship, through working with you, with Matt Jones, through looking at pots with a very certain lens for a long time. So yeah, we really simplified things because it was very clear that was what the market was calling for. And what we've done is embrace color in a way that I think even a lot of other folks are not, but we embrace color in a, I mean, Connie sort of really led all of our color exploration. And if you look at all of our colors together, it's this sort of big hodgepodge. But when you think about them in families and place settings, the colors have become sort of like a sneaker drop for us. So when we release a new color, people go crazy. If you go on eBay, there's a secondary market for the work that's popped up in all of these trade communities on Instagram, and it's really amazing to see. But yeah, so we saw what was happening in North Carolina with the collectors in the Southeast, and then we saw what was happening to places like Lenox, which just shut down their plant in Kinston. Lenox was the only bone china manufacturer in the U.S. And we could see the writing on the wall because it was happening all around us. And then when I started to find machines, I was going sort of digging through the rubble of all of these factories that had gone under because they would not change. They simply didn't invest in design. They didn't invest in sort of understanding what the next generation wanted. And they just kept making the same thing. They kept watching it be made cheaper in China, and they were competing with China or Portugal or Southeast Asia. And right now I don't feel like we're really competing with anyone, which is nice.
That's a brilliant place to be in. I think we've seen actually, with Villeroy Bosch and others, where there's that real emphasis on quality, design, and marketing and skill. Actually, there's a huge market for great products out there. But the lesson of Wedgwood is exactly what you're doing, Alex, which is about the importance of design and the importance of understanding design and the importance of understanding where the consumer is going and how you want to connect with them based upon your vision and your values and your productive capacity. So there are kind of lots of good examples out there. And then, as I think, Mark and I know only too well in terms of the history of Stoke-on-Trent, lots of bad examples of kind of over conglomeration, no investment in art, no investment in design, almost a kind of contempt for the artists and designers who actually create these works of wonder, and simply thinking, as you say, that you can compete on low price. But Wedgwood was always very clear on this. Low price beget low quality, and there is an end of the trade. And so having a quality product people will pay for in the long run yields success. And I wish you all the very best with it.